The Courage to be Disliked opens not with a lecture, but with a conversation, a dramatic meeting between a philosopher and a young man. The two represent opposing forces of thought. One believes that life can be free, simple, and happy if one chooses. The other, that life is unjust, constrained, and painful. Through their dialogue, the authors, Ichiro Kishimi and Fumitake Koga, present the psychological philosophy of Alfred Adler, one of the three giants of modern psychology alongside Freud and Jung, in a way that is both deeply human and immediately practical. The setting is minimal, a quiet study lined with books. The young man arrives, frustrated and skeptical, determined to disprove the philosopher's claim that anyone can be happy. He insists that life is ruled by trauma, circumstance, and social limitation. The philosopher welcomes him calmly, promising to show that freedom and happiness are possible for all people, regardless of background, age, or experience, if they are willing to change their perspective. This framing device, the ongoing dialogue between the idealistic philosopher and the cynical youth, gives the book its unique rhythm. Each night's conversation takes the form of a challenge and a rebuttal. The philosopher's task is not to persuade, but to awaken. The young man's resistance mirrors the reader's own doubts. Is happiness really a choice? Can one simply decide to be free of the past? Isn't that naive? At the heart of Adlerian psychology, which underpins the entire book, lies a revolutionary idea. You are not controlled by your past, but by the meaning you give to it. In contrast to Freud's belief that people are bound by unconscious desires and childhood trauma, Adler saw human behavior as purposeful. Every action, emotion, or belief serves a goal, even suffering. People don't act according to their experiences. They act according to the goals they set in response to those experiences. This subtle shift changes everything. It means that, no matter what one's history, happiness and freedom remain within reach. We are not victims of fate, society, or upbringing. Rather, we create meaning through our own interpretations and choices. Your life, the philosopher says, is decided not by what happened to you in the past, but by what you choose to do now. The young man protests. He insists that people cannot simply erase the scars of trauma or the inequalities of society. The philosopher agrees. The past cannot be undone, but insists that it can be reinterpreted. The meaning of an event is not fixed. Even pain can be recast as a source of growth, resilience, or compassion. The moment one stops blaming the past, one begins to live in the present. The book's title captures its thesis. Courage is required to be disliked. In other words, to live freely, to act according to your own beliefs and not in pursuit of approval, demands bravery. Most people live in quiet chains, bound by the fear of rejection. They suppress their individuality to maintain belonging. They measure their worth by others' opinions. Adler called this the fundamental trap of human unhappiness. The philosopher challenges this dependence on external validation. To be truly free, he says, is to accept that you will not be liked by everyone, and that's okay. True happiness arises when you live in harmony with your own values, not when you are constantly adjusting to others' expectations. This doesn't mean being selfish or indifferent. In fact, Adler's approach emphasizes community feeling, the sense of belonging and contribution to others. But contribution can only come from self-acceptance. When you no longer seek to control others' opinions or lives, and you no longer allow others to control yours, you find genuine connection based on respect, not manipulation. Unlike many self-help books, The Courage to be Disliked does not offer formulas or steps to success. Instead, it dismantles the assumptions that make people feel powerless. It insists that the conditions for happiness already exist within each of us. What is required is a new way of seeing. The philosopher's voice is calm, almost parental, yet uncompromising. The youth's anger, defensiveness, and doubt make him real, a stand-in for every reader who has ever felt trapped by circumstance. By blending philosophy, psychology, and storytelling, Kishimi and Koga create a work that feels timeless yet urgent. It is not about escaping the world, but about seeing it differently. through the lens of courage, self-responsibility, and compassion. As the philosopher reminds us in the opening dialogue, you are free. You just don't have the courage to be. Chapter 1. Deny Trauma. The first night of conversation begins with a declaration that shocks the young man. Trauma does not exist. The philosopher's tone is calm, but his claim lands like a provocation. To the youth, who believes his unhappiness stems from his past and the injustices he has endured, such an idea sounds cruel, even absurd. He protests that people are products of their experiences. Those who have suffered pain or neglect cannot simply decide to be happy. The philosopher listens, then offers the central idea of Adlerian psychology. It is not our experiences that determine our lives, but the meaning we attach to them. This is the cornerstone of what Adler called teleology, the belief that human behavior is guided not by causes from the past, but by goals directed toward the future. Freud's psychology was ideological. He believed our present state was the result of past causes, especially childhood trauma. Adler, however, saw people as active agents, not passive victims. We are always moving toward something. Even emotions like anger or sadness serve a purpose. When someone becomes angry, Adler said, it is not because they can't help it, but because anger is useful in achieving a particular end, such as asserting control, avoiding responsibility, or gaining sympathy. The philosopher explains this through a simple example. Imagine a child who feels ignored by their parents. They may develop an illness or throw tantrums, not consciously, but as a means to draw attention and regain significance. The behavior has a goal. In the same way, adults might cling to their traumas as a way of explaining why they can't change. I can't succeed because of my upbringing. I can't trust because I was betrayed. I can't love because I was hurt. These are not objective truths, but interpretations that serve a psychological purpose. They protect us from the anxiety of freedom. The young man, increasingly agitated, accuses the philosopher of denying suffering itself. But the philosopher clarifies that Adler never denied the reality of painful experiences, only their power to dictate the present. The past is a collection of events. Its emotional weight depends entirely on the meaning we assign to it today. The key, therefore, is not to forget or erase the past, but to stop using it as an excuse to avoid living. You can choose a new meaning, the philosopher says. You can choose to live differently. To illustrate this, he tells the story of a reclusive man who refused to leave his room, claiming social anxiety made it impossible. The philosopher asks what would happen if someone told the man his house was on fire. Would he still claim he couldn't go outside? Of course not. He would run out immediately. The point is clear. Even our so-called limitations are situational. When the purpose changes, behavior changes instantly. The man's isolation wasn't caused by fear. It was maintained by the goal of avoiding contact and responsibility. Once the goal shifts, survival in this case, the fear disappears. The young man recoils from this. He insists that people cannot simply change their feelings by choosing new goals. You're saying my suffering is my own fault? He demands. But the philosopher shakes his head. It's not about fault, but about responsibility. To blame the past is to hand over one's power. To take responsibility is to reclaim it. You may not have chosen what happened to you, but you can choose how to interpret it now. That choice determines your freedom. The conversation deepens when the philosopher introduces the concept of life tasks. Every person, he says, has three essential tasks: work, friendship, and love. Failure or fear in these areas often leads people to create excuses rooted in the past. For example, someone who avoids relationships may justify it by saying, I was hurt before. Someone who fails to pursue their ambitions may say, I wasn't given the right opportunities. But in Adler's view, these statements conceal a hidden decision. I choose not to try because trying might bring pain. When we say we can't, what we often mean is, I've decided not to. The philosopher likens this to standing before a locked door with the key in hand, but refusing to turn it, convinced it won't open. The lock is real, but so is the key. The challenge is not external. It's internal, a question of courage. It takes courage to accept that you are free to choose, because freedom also means responsibility. If you admit you are not bound by your past, then you can no longer hide behind it. That realization terrifies the young man. He accuses the philosopher of being unrealistic, of ignoring the suffering of those born into poverty, illness, or abuse. The philosopher acknowledges those realities but insists that even within limitation, one can choose attitude. You may not control what happens, he says gently, but you control how you respond. And in that response lies your freedom. Slowly, the youth begins to see the danger of determinism, the belief that life is fixed by past events. Determinism may seem comforting because it absolves us of responsibility. If the past is to blame, then nothing is required of us now. But that comfort is an illusion. It keeps us trapped in narratives that deny growth. To be free, the philosopher says, is not to erase your scars, but to stop using them as your identity. The conversation closes with a challenge. The philosopher invites the young man to imagine that he could become anyone he wanted, right now, if he were willing to change the meaning of his experiences. What kind of person would you be, he asks. The young man hesitates, unable to answer. His silence reveals the real issue, not whether change is possible, but whether he dares to choose it. The first night ends with tension unresolved. The youth storms out, accusing the philosopher of being heartless. Yet a seed of doubt has been planted. Perhaps his suffering isn't fate. Perhaps he has been protecting his pain because it feels safer than freedom. The philosopher's words echo as he leaves. You are not determined by your past. You are deciding your present and your future every moment. This chapter dismantles the first great illusion that binds people, that our past defines us. In its place, it offers something far more challenging and liberating. If trauma does not determine our destiny, then the power to change lies squarely within us. And with that power comes responsibility. The responsibility to choose, to act, and to live courageously in the present. Chapter 2. All problems are interpersonal relationship problems. The second night begins with the young man returning reluctantly to the philosopher's home. He has spent the week wrestling with the idea that the past does not define the present. He still finds it difficult to accept. Yet something about the philosopher's calm certainty draws him back. When the philosopher opens the door, he welcomes the young man with quiet warmth, as if their first debate had never ended. This time, the young man arrives with a new question. Even if I accept that I can change, he says, why is it that my life feels miserable no matter what I do? Why do people make each other so unhappy? The philosopher smiles and replies with another radical claim. All human problems are interpersonal relationship problems. The young man is incredulous. He insists there are many problems that have nothing to do with people, loneliness, anxiety, failure, self-hatred. But the philosopher gently argues that each of these is rooted in how we perceive ourselves in relation to others. Loneliness, after all, is not the absence of people but the absence of connection. Anxiety often arises from fear of judgment. Even self-hatred grows from comparing oneself to others. Strip away relationships, and these problems dissolve. To illustrate, the philosopher invites the young man to imagine living alone on a deserted island. There would be no one to compete with, no one to please or disappoint, no one to judge. Would concepts like inferiority, success, or even failure have meaning? The young man admits they wouldn't. Without others, there is no basis for comparison. The philosopher nods. That is the point, he says. Your suffering exists because you live in relation to others. You measure yourself by others' standards and chase their approval. You live not your own life, but a life defined by how you think others see you. The conversation turns to feelings of inferiority, one of Adler's most important ideas. Every person, the philosopher explains, begins life feeling small and helpless, especially in childhood. These feelings are natural and even useful. They motivate growth and effort. But problems arise when inferiority becomes an identity instead of a challenge. Some people develop what Adler called an inferiority complex. They use their feelings of inadequacy as an excuse not to act. They say, I'm not talented, I'm not attractive, I wasn't educated well, and therefore they stop trying. The young man recognizes himself in these words. Others, the philosopher continues, swing in the opposite direction, creating a superiority complex. This, too, is a defense, an attempt to mask inferiority through arrogance, status-seeking, or contempt. The person who boasts or looks down on others is not truly confident. They are terrified of being seen as small. In either case, life becomes a constant struggle for validation. People compete, compare, and resent. They feel that happiness is a race that someone else is always winning. The philosopher pauses and says softly, "You believe that life is a competition, don't you?" The young man hesitates, then nods. Yes, school, work, love, everything feels like a contest. If you are not better than others, you are nothing. The philosopher smiles sadly. That belief, he says, is the source of your unhappiness. Adler's psychology rejects competition as a basis for living. When you see life as a contest, others become enemies, not companions. Every success or compliment is a reminder of your own perceived failure. True freedom comes when you stop comparing altogether. You are not living to defeat others, the philosopher says. You are living to fulfill your own tasks in your own way. The young man protests that comparison is inevitable, that society itself runs on evaluation. Schools grade students, jobs rank employees. But the philosopher distinguishes between functional evaluation and existential comparison. It's natural to assess skills for practical purposes, but it's destructive to tie one's worth to those measures. When you say, "I'm inferior," the philosopher explains, you are judging your existence, not your effort. The goal is not to become better than someone, but to become useful to someone. This idea leads to a turning point in the dialogue. The philosopher introduces the concept of community feeling, the sense of belonging and mutual contribution to others. Humans, Adler believed, are social beings whose happiness depends on feeling connected and valuable within a group. But this sense of connection can't be achieved by competition. It grows through cooperation. When people stop trying to prove their worth through comparison, they can finally see others not as rivals, but as comrades sharing the same human journey. The young man struggles with this. But what if I don't like people? He asks. What if I've been hurt too many times to trust them? The philosopher nods with understanding. You don't dislike people, he says. You fear being disliked by them. The young man falls silent. The philosopher explains that fear of rejection leads to withdrawal, a form of self-protection that isolates us further. We avoid relationships to avoid pain, but in doing so, we guarantee loneliness. The cure for loneliness is not to seek admiration, but to develop the courage to connect without conditions. The philosopher then challenges a deeply rooted assumption that we need others' recognition to feel worthy. You live for others' approval, he says, but that means you are never truly free. As long as you act to please or impress, your life is ruled by others' judgments. To be happy, you must accept that some people will dislike you, misunderstand you, or think poorly of you, and that's fine. Their opinions are their tasks, not yours. The young man, though unsettled, begins to see the logic. If all problems are interpersonal, then the solution must lie in how we relate to others and to ourselves. The philosopher tells him that love, work, and friendship are all opportunities to practice equality. The healthiest relationships are horizontal, not vertical. In a horizontal relationship, no one stands above or below the other. There is mutual respect and contribution. In a vertical one, based on control, dependence, or fear, there can only be tension. Stop trying to be special, the philosopher advises. Instead, try to be of use. That is where genuine happiness begins. As the night draws to a close, the young man sits quietly, reflecting. For the first time, he realizes that much of his suffering has come from constant comparison, the exhausting belief that he must prove his worth through others' eyes. He has been running a race that never ends. Perhaps, he thinks, life isn't a competition at all. Perhaps the freedom he seeks is not to win, but to stop running. The philosopher ends the evening with a simple truth. When you see others as comrades rather than enemies, your problems will lose their power. The moment you stop comparing, you can begin to love, to work, and to live. Chapter 3. Discard other people's tasks. The young man returns for their third night of conversation, visibly restless. He admits that the philosopher's ideas about comparison and interpersonal conflict have stayed with him. Yet, he says, they have also made his life more confusing. If all problems are caused by relationships, he begins, then how am I supposed to live with other people? I can't just ignore them. I still need their approval, their cooperation. If I stop caring what people think, won't I become isolated or selfish? The philosopher smiles gently. That is a common misunderstanding, he replies. Freedom from others' approval is not the same as indifference to others. What you must learn is the difference between what is your task and what is theirs. When you can tell them apart, you will no longer be controlled by others, and you will no longer try to control them. The young man frowns, intrigued but skeptical. Tasks, he asks. What do you mean? The philosopher explains that every person has responsibilities or tasks that belong to them alone, actions and decisions that are ultimately their own to make. Problems arise when we cross those boundaries, when we interfere in other people's tasks or allow them to interfere in ours. This confusion creates conflict, guilt, and resentment. The essence of freedom, he says, lies in task separation, understanding clearly where your responsibility ends and another's begins. He gives an example. Imagine a child who refuses to study. Most parents instinctively think it's their problem, that they must make the child study. But in Adlerian terms, studying is the child's task, not the parent's. The parent's task is to provide opportunities and support. Whether the child chooses to learn is their responsibility. When a parent crosses into the child's task, by forcing, scolding, or bribing, both suffer. The child loses motivation and autonomy. The parent becomes anxious and resentful. True education, the philosopher says, is not about control but about trust. The young man protests that this approach sounds like neglect. So we just do nothing when others make mistakes? The philosopher shakes his head. Not nothing, he says. We encourage. We offer help when asked. But we do not take over. To interfere in others' tasks, even with good intentions, is to deny their freedom and their ability to grow. Likewise, allowing others to dictate our own choices is to surrender our freedom. He pauses, then looks directly at the young man. You live every day trying to be liked, don't you? That is not your task. Whether someone likes you or not, that is their task. The young man's face tightens. How can I not care what others think? People's opinions matter. If everyone hates me, how could I be happy? The philosopher answers quietly. You cannot control what another person feels about you. Their emotions belong to them. You can act sincerely, speak honestly, and live by your values. But whether they approve or reject you is beyond your control. To base your life on their reactions is to hand them the steering wheel of your existence. He continues, you may think that trying to please others will win their affection, but in truth, it only creates anxiety. You begin to act not as yourself, but as the image you believe they desire. That is not love, it is fear, and no one can be happy while living in fear. The young man grows silent, turning this over in his mind. He begins to see how much of his energy is spent managing others' perceptions, choosing words, suppressing feelings, avoiding disapproval. So, he says hesitantly, you mean that if I stop trying to control what others think, I might actually feel lighter? The philosopher nods. Exactly. Once you discard others' tasks, you will find that the world feels spacious again. You will realize that most of what burdens you does not belong to you at all. The conversation shifts to a deeper question. If we are not to interfere with others, what does genuine relationship look like? The philosopher explains that true connection arises from respect, not control. Respect means acknowledging the other as a separate individual with their own choices and responsibilities. Love, he says, is not about possessing or changing someone. It is about standing beside them, even when their path differs from yours. The young man laughs bitterly. That sounds nice in theory. But what about people who make wrong choices, friends who ruin their lives, family members who hurt others. Don't we have a duty to intervene? Intervention is sometimes necessary, the philosopher admits. But before acting, you must ask, whose task is this? Will my action truly help them grow, or will it only satisfy my desire to feel in control? Many so-called acts of kindness, he adds, are actually disguised forms of domination. We help not for others' sake, but to feel superior or needed. Real compassion respects autonomy. It offers guidance but leaves the decision and its consequences in the other's hands. The young man grows quiet again. Then maybe, he says slowly, I've been interfering all my life. Trying to make people like me, trying to fix them, trying to get approval. I thought that was caring. But maybe I was just afraid of being rejected. The philosopher smiles kindly. Exactly. Fear of rejection drives us to invade others' tasks. We believe that if we can control their feelings or outcomes, we'll be safe. But the opposite is true. The more you try to control others, the more you lose yourself. Freedom and peace come only when you stand on your own feet and let others stand on theirs. He leans back, then adds one final thought. To live your own life is to bear the risk of being disliked. That is why this book is called The Courage to be Disliked. The courage to separate tasks, to say, this is mine, and that is yours, is the same courage it takes to live authentically. The young man looks down, realizing the depth of this statement. He has always believed that connection required compliance, that being accepted meant constantly adjusting himself to others' expectations. Now, he sees that real connection begins with independence. But isn't it lonely, he asks softly, to live without trying to please anyone? The philosopher shakes his head. It is the only way not to be lonely. When you no longer manipulate others or allow them to manipulate you, you can finally meet them as equals. Only then can there be true companionship. The night ends in thoughtful silence. The young man feels both liberated and unsettled. If what the philosopher says is true, he must give up not only his resentment, but also the comfort of blame. He must stop saying, they made me unhappy, and start asking, why do I give them that power? It is a frightening realization, but also a freeing one. As he leaves, the philosopher's voice follows him into the dark. Freedom is found not in controlling others, but in letting them go. Live your own task and allow others to live theirs. Only then will you find peace. Chapter 4. Where the Center of the World Is. When the young man returns for the fourth night, something in his demeanor has changed. His earlier defiance has softened into curiosity. The philosopher's words about separating tasks have unsettled him deeply. For the first time, he has tried applying them in his daily life. He tells the philosopher that he stopped trying to force a friend to change, and, to his surprise, their friendship felt calmer. It was strange, he admits, as if a weight had lifted from my shoulders. The philosopher nods approvingly. You began to see where you end and where others begin. That is the beginning of freedom. Yet freedom, the young man confesses, feels hollow. If I stop caring what others think, if I stop competing or comparing, then what's left? What's the point of living just for myself? He frowns. It feels meaningless. The philosopher smiles gently, as though expecting this question. That is the next step, he says. Freedom from others is only half the journey. The other half is discovering where to place yourself in the world once you are free. Until now, you have lived at the center of your own universe. Everything has revolved around your desires, fears, and approval. But the world does not exist for you alone. The key to happiness lies in shifting the center of your world outward, from self-interest to contribution. The young man looks puzzled. Contribution, he repeats. You mean helping others? In part, the philosopher replies, but not in the moralistic way people usually imagine. It is not about sacrifice or obligation. It is about realizing that your life gains meaning only in connection with others. Adler called this community feeling, the sense that you are part of a greater whole and that your existence benefits others, even in small ways. The young man hesitates. He has always thought of happiness as personal satisfaction, achievement, recognition, pleasure. The philosopher's definition feels foreign. But if life's meaning comes from others, he says, doesn't that contradict everything we talked about? Didn't you say I shouldn't live for other people? The philosopher shakes his head. Living for others' approval and living for others' sake are completely different. One is dependency, the other is contribution. When you live for approval, you seek to please others so you can feel worthy. When you live for contribution, you act because you already accept your own worth and wish to share it. He pauses, letting the idea sink in. To contribute, he continues, is to give something of yourself, kindness, work, creativity, love, without asking for recognition. It is not about reward. It is about realizing your connection to the human community. The young man listens quietly. For the first time, he senses the depth of the philosopher's view of freedom. It is not the isolation of the self, but the freedom to belong willingly. The philosopher explains that this idea of community feeling does not mean living for society's expectations or performing public service in grand gestures. It can be as simple as greeting a neighbor, caring for a family member, or doing one's work sincerely. The smallest acts, he says, when done with the awareness that they contribute to others, bring the deepest happiness. The young man is unconvinced. But people are selfish, he argues. They don't care about community, they care about themselves. And even if I want to contribute, won't others take advantage of me? The philosopher laughs softly. That is because you still see the world as a place of competition. You imagine that others are enemies, that kindness will be exploited. But when you view life as contribution, you realize that there are no true competitors, only companions. Everyone is trying, in their own imperfect way, to find belonging. He goes on to describe how our constant comparisons create a distorted view of the world, one in which others appear as obstacles or threats. This self-centered view isolates us. When you think only of yourself, he says, you shrink your world until it contains only you. Everything becomes a reflection of your ego. But when you think of contribution, your world expands endlessly. You become part of something larger, and that is where true happiness begins. The young man looks thoughtful. So you're saying the world doesn't revolve around me, he murmurs. Exactly, the philosopher replies. And yet, paradoxically, when you stop placing yourself at the center, you begin to feel truly centered. Because now your life has direction and meaning that are not dependent on others' praise or blame. They sit in silence for a moment before the philosopher continues. You asked before what the point of life is if not to seek happiness. The answer is this. Happiness is the byproduct of contribution. It cannot be pursued directly. When you focus on giving, rather than getting, you find yourself fulfilled. Life is not a competition to win or a test to pass. It is a series of opportunities to connect, to add value, to love. The young man leans back, lost in thought. He recalls times he felt genuine joy, teaching a child, helping a colleague, caring for a friend. Those moments, he realizes, had nothing to do with recognition or success. They were quiet, ordinary, yet deeply satisfying. The philosopher notices his change in expression. You see, he says, when you contribute to others, you forget yourself, and in forgetting yourself, you find yourself. Still, the young man hesitates. But what about love? He asks. You speak of community, but love seems to make people dependent, possessive, even miserable. Isn't love also an interpersonal problem? The philosopher nods. Love can be the purest form of contribution, or the most selfish. It depends on whether you approach it vertically or horizontally. A vertical relationship, where one tries to possess or dominate, leads to suffering. A horizontal relationship, where both stand as equals and support each other's growth, leads to joy. Love is not about controlling another's life. It is about walking side by side toward the future. He pauses and adds softly. The goal of love is not to complete yourself through another person, but to create a shared life in which both can contribute. That is what it means to move from self-centeredness to community feeling. The young man's expression softens. For the first time, he feels the outline of a different kind of life, one not defined by comparison or fear, but by purpose. Perhaps happiness is not something to be found, but something to be given. As the evening ends, the philosopher concludes with quiet conviction. The world you see is not objective. It reflects your standpoint. When you stand at the center of the self, the world is small and hostile. When you move the center outward, the world becomes vast and welcoming. Your task is to shift the center from yourself to the world. That is the courage to contribute. The young man nods slowly. For the first time, the philosopher's lessons do not feel abstract. They feel personal, practical, even hopeful. He leaves that night with a strange sense of peace, not because his problems are solved, but because he now sees that his life has meaning beyond them. As he walks into the night, the philosopher's words echo in his mind. You find yourself not by searching within, but by turning outward, by seeing the world as a place you belong to and can serve. Chapter 5. To live in earnest in the here and now. The young man arrives for their final meeting just before dawn. He looks different, calmer, but also uncertain. The philosopher notices immediately and smiles. You've been thinking, he says. The young man nods. I have. I've thought about the past, about others' opinions, about living for contribution. But the more I think, the more I feel I'm nowhere. If happiness comes from within, why do I still feel so lost? The philosopher pours tea and gestures for him to sit. You are standing at the threshold, he says. You understand freedom, but you have not yet begun to live it. Tonight, we will talk about what it means to live earnestly, to live fully in the here and now. The young man frowns. But isn't living in the moment just a cliché? People say that all the time. How can the present possibly matter more than the future I'm working toward or the past that shaped me? The philosopher answers patiently. The reason most people are unhappy is that they are always living somewhere else, trapped in yesterday or worried about tomorrow. They postpone life, believing happiness will come after they succeed, after they're approved of, after they become someone better. But life does not begin after, it begins now. The only time you can live, think, or love is this moment. The young man shakes his head. But isn't that careless? Shouldn't we plan for the future? If I just live for today, how will I achieve anything? The philosopher chuckles softly. Living in the present does not mean neglecting the future. It means acting sincerely in the moment, rather than being enslaved by what has not yet happened. You plan for the future best when you give your whole self to the present. A life of meaning is built one earnest moment at a time. He pauses, then adds, Adler said that people lose courage not because of failure, but because they are too focused on results. They ask, will this make me successful? Instead of asking, is this right for me now? They live in constant evaluation of themselves, of others, of outcomes. But if you focus on living earnestly in each moment, results take care of themselves. The young man stares into his teacup. That sounds ideal, he says, but I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. How do you live earnestly? What does that actually look like? The philosopher leans forward. To live earnestly, he says, is to act with sincerity and courage, without letting fear or approval dictate your actions. It means doing what is right because it is right, not because it will please someone or guarantee success or make you look good. It means embracing the risk of being disliked. The young man looks up. There it is again, he says with a half smile. The courage to be disliked. The philosopher nods. Yes, that is the final lesson. To live in the present, you must have the courage to be disliked by others, and sometimes by your own past self. Freedom and happiness require the willingness to disappoint expectations, to be misunderstood, to be alone if necessary. Most people cannot do this. They say they want to be free, but what they truly want is to be approved of, and so, they become prisoners of others' opinions. He continues, think of an actor on stage who constantly looks to the audience for applause. He may perform brilliantly, but his attention is divided. He acts not for the sake of the play, but for the clapping that follows. His performance, then, is never free. Life is the same. If you live for applause, from parents, friends, society, you will never be at peace. To live earnestly is to play your role with sincerity, even if no one is watching. The young man listens in silence. He realizes how much of his life has been spent performing, for teachers, for colleagues, for people who may not even remember his name. He has been living not as himself, but as a reflection of what he thought others wanted to see. The philosopher sees his expression and says gently, "When you no longer seek to prove your worth, you begin to live. Because worth is not something you earn, it is something you accept. You are valuable because you exist, not because you are praised or successful. Once you truly grasp that, you can live each day without fear." He goes on, "People often say they cannot change because it's too late, that they've wasted their lives or made too many mistakes. But time is not the issue. Life is always lived in the present. The past cannot be changed, and the future has not yet come. The only real question is, what will you do now?" The young man looks up. "But what if I fail? What if I live by my own choices and it all goes wrong?" "Then you fail as yourself." The philosopher replies simply, "That is the only kind of failure worth having. Most people never fail as themselves. They only fail as the person they pretend to be. Living earnestly means accepting the possibility of failure without letting it define you. Because even failure, when faced honestly, becomes growth." He adds softly, "Adler said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The courage to be disliked is, at its heart, the courage to be yourself." The young man sits back, his eyes bright with tears he doesn't try to hide. "All this time," he says quietly, "I thought happiness was something to reach someday. But you're saying it's something I can choose now." The philosopher smiles. "Exactly. You can choose it this very moment. Happiness is not a reward. It is a way of living. When you accept yourself, separate your tasks, and contribute to others with sincerity, you are already happy, whether others notice or not." The room is silent except for the faint rustling of the wind outside. The philosopher rises and opens the window. The sky is turning pale with dawn. "Look," he says, "the night is ending." The young man gazes out at the first light. The world looks ordinary. The same trees, the same street, yet somehow new. He feels no dramatic revelation, only a quiet steadiness, as if the world has settled into place. The philosopher speaks once more, his voice soft but firm. "The meaning of life is not something to be found in the distance. It is created here, in the act of living. Each moment is complete when you live it earnestly. That is all." The young man nods slowly. For the first time, he doesn't argue or question. He simply understands. He thanks the philosopher, not with words, but with a deep bow, the kind that carries gratitude beyond speech. Then he steps out into the morning light, walking without hurry, feeling the air on his face, aware of nothing but the simple truth of being alive. He is no longer searching for happiness. He is living it. Conclusion. The young man does not return to the philosopher's house after their fifth conversation. The dialogue has ended, yet its echo continues in his mind. Each idea, freedom from the past, the roots of interpersonal conflict, the separation of tasks, the feeling of community, and the call to live earnestly in the present, now feels less like abstract philosophy and more like a quiet rhythm guiding his days. He no longer argues with the philosopher in his thoughts. Instead, he begins to live as if the dialogue is ongoing, each moment an answer, each action a continuation of their unfinished talk. Weeks pass. The young man notices changes that are small but profound. He finds himself less anxious about being liked, less preoccupied with proving his worth. He speaks more honestly, listens more patiently, and feels less defensive when criticized. The opinions of others still sting sometimes, but the sting fades quickly. He reminds himself, that is their task, not mine. And slowly, he begins to experience what the philosopher had promised all along, freedom. This freedom is not dramatic or defiant. It is quiet, steady, and inward. It comes from the realization that happiness is not bestowed by anyone else, not by a lover, a boss, a friend, or even society, but chosen, moment by moment. It comes from the courage to stand alone, to act according to one's convictions, to be disliked if necessary. It is the freedom to live one's own life without apology. In the philosopher's view, this is the essence of Adlerian psychology, a psychology of courage. It rejects the chains of determinism, the idea that people are shaped unchangeably by the past or by external circumstances. It insists instead on purpose, choice, and meaning. You may have been hurt, overlooked, or underestimated, but those experiences are not your destiny. You are not the sum of your wounds. You are the meaning maker of your own life. And yet, this freedom is not selfish or solitary. To be free does not mean to turn away from others, but to engage with them more authentically. When you stop living to impress or control, you become capable of genuine love and contribution. You begin to see people not as rivals or judges, but as fellow travelers. You learn that to live for yourself and to live for others are not opposites. They are one and the same path, walked with sincerity. The philosopher's teaching carries a paradox that the young man only now begins to grasp. Happiness is not achieved by chasing it. It emerges naturally when you stop running. It is found not in self-assertion, but in self-forgetfulness, in the moments when you give your attention, energy, or kindness to something beyond yourself. In those moments, life expands. The boundaries of I dissolve, and a quiet sense of belonging takes its place. He also understands now what it means to live in the here and now. It does not mean abandoning dreams or ignoring responsibility. It means realizing that life is not a rehearsal. Every day, every conversation, every small decision is the real performance. There is no someday when happiness will finally arrive. There is only today. The courage to be disliked, in its deepest sense, is the courage to live this day fully, even if others do not understand, even if the past whispers doubts, even if the future remains uncertain. In the philosopher's study, there had been a line written on a small piece of parchment pinned above the desk. The young man remembers it now, though he hadn't paid much attention to it before. Freedom is being disliked by others. When he first read it, he had thought it arrogant, even cold. Now, it feels like compassion in its purest form. To be disliked and still live kindly, to respect others' freedom as much as one's own, is perhaps the highest form of love. And love, as the philosopher hinted, is not possession or dependency. It is the mutual encouragement between equals who walk side by side, supporting each other's growth. Whether in friendship, family, or partnership, true love begins only when both people can say, I am responsible for my own happiness, and I honor your right to yours. Standing one morning at the edge of a park, watching children play, the young man realizes he has stopped analyzing his every feeling. The air is crisp. The laughter of strangers fills the space around him. For the first time in years, he feels no urge to compare, to perform, to prove. He simply breathes. He is at peace with the simple fact of being alive. He thinks of the philosopher and smiles, not with longing or regret, but with gratitude. The conversation may have ended, but its essence lives within him, not as a doctrine to memorize, but as a way of being. To live freely, to contribute sincerely, to face life with courage. In the end, the courage to be disliked is not about rebellion, nor about indifference. It is about authenticity, the quiet bravery to be yourself in a world that constantly asks you to be someone else. It is about creating meaning where none seems given, and about finding happiness not in perfection, but in participation. The philosopher's final lesson lingers in the air, unspoken but ever present. You are free. You always have been. The question is not whether you can be happy, but whether you have the courage to be.